This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the biggest films in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. Well, a very controversial week for those in the nexus of Jay's Analysis readers, and Esoteric Hollywood listeners. And a lot of things to say, I guess. A lot of stuff going on as well. So let's get down to it. What we're going to do in this podcast is cover the book Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future by Father Seraphim Rose, the famous convert who became a monk and dedicated his life to the reawakening of Western man to his forgotten spiritual truths that arise out of the Eastern Orthodox faith. Now, I've read a good bit of Father Rose's works over the years, and I read several chapters of this book online years ago, probably 10 years ago, and so I finally got around to getting a hard copy and reading the rest of it. And I was pretty impressed. I'm going to say 4 out of 5 stars. There's a couple chapters that are kind of goofy and a little overboard in terms of the kind of fear of the last days kind of stuff. But that's really a minor portion of the book. For the rest of the content, I'm going to have to say it's pretty top notch. So we're going to go through that book today, hit the high points. And of course, if you're a listener, if you're new, the first hour is always free, and the second hour is for paid subscribers. So if you're not familiar with Orthodox theology, that's okay. This is going to be a philosophical and theological approach to the question of the coming religion of the future, i.e. the New Age movement, its connection to Darwinism, its connection to Eastern meditation and Eastern traditions, and the so-called New World Order, and the UFO phenomena. And again, how this all relates to Darwinism and the notion of higher sentient beings that are directing our, quote, evolution. The space beings. E.T. Saint E.T., the holy spirit being of the new coming religion. I'm joking. Now, so the book begins, and another thing we have to remember too, this book is prophetic because it was written in the 70s. I think their editors have added a few chapters and appendices or something like that. Written in 75, and it comes out of the St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood Monastery, and the good work of Hieromonk Damascene, I guess is kind of famous now. Cults too will play into this. We're going to see CIA cults. He doesn't go into the CIA so much as he does look at the deep state though, and kind of hints at the deep state connection to a lot of the UFO phenomenon, and that's a big part of it. So that's another area of minor critique that I have, is that there's a little too much acceptance of what was put out there and not enough skepticism over so-called deep state operatives like Jacques Vallée or John Keel or Hynek or Corso or any of these phonies who are pretty much, apparatchiks of the deep state. I mean, they're there to foster and promote the myth of aliens and evolution and how it ties into a new coming religion. And so, I dealt with that in my book, Esoteric Hollywood, and how Hollywood has promoted that. And again, a lot of this book I had not read, so it very, very closely lines up with what's in my book. But it includes a lot of details and a lot of angles that I didn't touch on. Now, I wrote a piece before we get into Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. I wrote a piece about a week ago that caused quite a stir in, as I said, the nexus, the orbit of Jay's Analysis. and got a lot of views. Had, I don't know, 800 shares or so now, somewhere in there on this article. So had a good bit of readers, and the comment threads I lost contact. It's just too much. I can't keep up with hundreds of comments, and that's what we've gotten to now with this article. And just to briefly touch on a response to a few of those points. Number one, I was never a libertarian. I never promoted libertarianism, except for the fact that I did work in the Rand Paul campaign because I thought that he would be better than the other options. And it was also local politics related to me in terms of Kentucky, and when I was doing undergrad and graduate work. So to me, the Rand Paul campaign was relevant. Ron Paul campaign, I hoped for stopping of the war and all this kind of stuff, but then when we saw that Ron Paul was obviously not going to win anything, and there was stealing, they were stealing shit from him in the primaries, I kind of just gave up on politics, pretty much because I believe that the entire American system was a joke, more or less. And it kind of is, but you see that's the brilliance, I think, of Trump, is that he's the postmodern president. And that's not to say that means that the American, quote, system is legitimate. It's not. It's an engine that is real, though. It does exist, for good or for ill. And unfortunately, it has for a long time been turned to ill purposes. And so the question then is, well, could there really be somebody who's a troll and who's going to try to reverse some of this? And I think for the cynics, for the people who've spent a lot of time, in what we might call anarcho-libertarian type circles, there's just the de facto acceptance of no such possibility. A very cynical worldview. Everything is controlled. Nobody really opposes, quote, evil. Why is this? Well, because the attitude is that power in itself is somehow evil, or it's essentially never challenged or never changes hands. Nobody ever changes things, basically. It's just the status quo of the eternal battle between the libertarian individual, the atomistic individual, and the collective superstate or something. Whatever the mythology or narrative is supposed to be. And that's why I'm not a libertarian. I never have been. You will never find... You might find articles where for a while a long time ago, maybe I misunderstood the Cold War because I'd not really delved into Quigley beyond people talking about Quigley and what Quigley supposedly said. So the last few years I really actually dove into Quigley and read the entire thing and got a better picture of the Cold War. But even Quigley, right, is not going to tell you that the entire Cold War is all fake. It's more so a managed dialectic, but the differences are real. And so in the same way, when we talk about dialectics, and this is going to come up in Orthodoxy and in religion in the future, so it's not completely irrelevant to the subject at hand. When we talk about dialectics, those in the truth community, the independent media, the Ron Paul Tea Party types, the anti-war left, the what else? Anybody that we want to classify out there in media land that's not, CNN or Fox or whatever. The attitude generally is when you come into understanding 9/11 or whatever it is, right? You quote, wake up. The attitude is very, still, I believe, left-centered. And when I say that, what do I mean? Well, I mean the leftism of classical liberalism. And if you recall, in the Carol Quigley talks that I did, we discussed Quigley's admission that classical liberalism was Banker Plan 2.0. Okay? Now, what that means is that Adam Smith, John Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes to an extent, Reed, Jefferson, Franklin, blah, 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 blah. all of these characters have been so formative for the modern world that we don't even know how to think outside these categories. We don't even know how to question the most basic fundamentals of liberalism. And that's because of the success of the British empiricist, pragmatist enlightenment and that whole project. So when I talk about Immanuel Kant writing essays about global government, or when I talk about the French Revolution and bankers and Masons being behind that and an ultimate push for a world government state, or when I talk about Jacobins and Girondins, and they're both the origins of the modern false left-right dialectic, right? When I talk about von Hayek talking about world government and global government as a good thing, I am not saying that therefore means that all distinctions or oppositions are a controlled dialectic. And this is a very important thing, right? So, for example, good and evil. Oh, that's just a controlled dialectic, man. We just live inside a Gnostic matrix, and once we see outside the matrix, we realize there's no good or evil. It's just no. You see, the era of this kind of thinking, which I guess could ultimately maybe lead to some kind of Far Eastern Buddhist sort of nihilist, annihilationist type of perspective that the ego has to be completely wiped out. That is not true. That is not the view that I take. Okay, my view is that the whole modern world in the West especially is, for the most part, exceptionally conditioned by the events of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Reformation. Okay, these big movements, scientific revolution, etc. And what that means is that the dominance of that philosophy and its progeny, like Darwinism, Marxism, Freudianism, this has so permeated things, and monopoly capitalism, that people have a very difficult time questioning it, questioning these presuppositions, or thinking outside of it, because it's the milieu in which they've been raised. It's the water that they drink, it's the air they breathe. And it's just never even thought to be something you question. I did question these things. How did I get there? Well, I read the Bible a lot when I was in my teens and then in my 20s and even still. And I never really questioned that the basic teaching of the Bible was true and accurate from my perspective. I might have had different views of who God is or was, and maybe, refined those points over the years. But to me, I never accepted atheism and I never accepted agnosticism because they just didn't make any rational, reasonable sense to me. And I had a conversion process out of kind of a new agey sort of liberal idea, roughly not believing anything, maybe when I was 18. And ever since then, it's just kind of been a roller coaster journey of learning and experiencing new things in relationship to theology. Now, I understand that not everybody took that trek, and most people are not going to, probably. That's okay, I understand. I'm not trying to convince you that I have experienced everything perfectly and that I know everything or that I'm right about everything. But I do believe that my perspective has a philosophical basis, a logical basis, that it can be demonstrated, and that you can do apologetics. And so Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future is a very great bridge into that kind of a discussion, particularly for Jay's analysis, because it is both an apologetic and it's a rough defense of Orthodoxy, and it deals with the New World Order and one of its controlled major movements, the big-time New Age movement. So, again, it's not that... Okay, this is very difficult to explain to people, especially if you haven't studied worldviews and how worldviews work, and they work kind of like a system. Just to use a computer analogy, and I'm not saying that humans like biological bots. I'm not saying that. I'm just using it as an analogy. So it's very difficult to get people to understand that the way that they interpret the world is based on their worldview. It's based on a systems theory, you might say, analysis of human thinking and how humans look at the world and approach it and interpret it. So I focused on that very intently. I would almost damn near say I'm close to an expert in that, in worldview philosophies and how they operate. I'm not bragging when I say that, but it's something I put a lot of time into. And I believe that the way they function, and it ties into things like psychology and all that too, is governed by presuppositions. So it's governed by things that we maybe not even are conscious of, beliefs that we have about the world that, for example, may not be empirically verified. Okay, let's just think of one off the top of our heads. That I exist. Okay. Now, outside of a philosophy class and a bunch of underarmed, stinky nerds sitting around debating in Philosophy 101 whether they exist, most people operate in their day-to-day existence as if they exist, right? They're not having the ivory tower. Actually, it's not an ivory tower. They're not having the Bauhaus fluorescent light tower discussion with the stinky armpit dudes in Philosophy 101 about whether they have existence or whether it's an illusion, right? They're operating as if they do exist. And unless you assume certain things, your own existence and self-consciousness is not something that you can necessarily empirically prove, right? You can't, like, for example, if one adopted maybe the kind of Maya argument or Descartes' Cartesian, maybe I'm just living in a dream and this is all, big phantasm or whatever. Well, if you took that view, it would be very difficult, if that's a presupposition, to demonstrate empirically, for example, that you exist to yourself or to others, because the presupposition there has already conditioned every phenomena of experience to be read as an illusion, right? Everything's illusory, including all your experiences. So it's absolutely impossible with that presupposition to demonstrate empirically that you exist because every empirical event or phenomena or whatever experience is illusory. Right? So how might we critique that view, for example? How might a person who takes the approach that I do, how might I critique this goofy sort of pseudo-philosophical perspective of, everything's an illusion and there's no way to disprove that or know that? Well, we'll do a presuppositional critique, and it's very easy to do, right? So again, how are we going to do this? We're going to think about the presupposition. The starting point is crucial, and this is what you always want to critique. You always want to start with the starting point. What's the starting point of this view? The starting point of this view is that the individual can make the experience to assume, or can make the assumption that he has learned or come to the truth, the awakening, quote unquote, so-called, that all reality is illusory. And maybe they had a bad drug trip or something, and they realized that they said, oh man, I was like tripping out, and then I realized that like I'm just a flat little bit of flatland non-existence, man. And we're all inside a flatland matrix. We don't exist. It's an illusion, man. It's a dream. Well, the problem with that view, from a presuppositional perspective, for example, would be that if everything in your experience is an illusion, then your coming to the realization that everything is an illusion is also an illusion. You see, so then from the outset, it's self-contradictory and nonsense. And you say, well, maybe I adopt a view that's self-contradictory and nonsense. Well, okay, you can do that, but two replies to that. Number one, if you adopt a view that's self-contradictory and nonsensical, then you have no claim on anyone else's worldview. You have no basis for debating or arguing or critiquing anything. And by the way, you can't state anything objectively because there is no objectivity. So all morals, all objectivity, all truth is gone because that's, part of the so-called dialectic or whatever. It's all an illusion. So you can't even talk. So get out of here. Like, you're worthless, useless, meaningless. You have nothing to say. Literally, you cannot talk because your words are gobbledygook gibberish and they don't have any meaning. But you seem to be sitting here communicating and arguing with me about how your meditation led you to believe that everything is an illusion. So you're debating and doing apologetics and using words and terms and assuming objective meanings and metaphysical principles, which do not comport with the other presupposition that there is no reality, that it's all illusion. So you're just a jumbled mass of gobbledygook contradictions. So that's how we disprove something like that. The other point I wanted to make too is that anytime that you try to argue, okay, this is not happening in a vacuum. A discussion, a debate, making a point, making a claim, universal claim. This is basic logic. Okay, anytime you're doing something like that, you're assuming things. And it doesn't matter whether you want to assume them or not, you are. It doesn't matter whether you recognize that you're assuming these things or not, you are. Again, it doesn't matter, right? So if you say it's perfectly logical to believe that nothing exists and I am living in an illusion or a dream, then the words that you're using and the things that you're talking about, like logic, when you say something is logical, when you say it is true that I live in an illusion, it is true that there's no reality, then you also cannot have objective logical principles operating in your worldview, because those are also part of the illusion, you see. Right. So this totally falls apart. It's total nonsense and it's totally stupid. And it's a perfect segue into Orthodoxy and the religion of the future, because for however many decades, the Rockefeller Foundation and the United Nations and their monstrosities and babies and progenies and Mongoloid offspring have been promoting Far Eastern thought. They've been promoting these things. With all this money. And of course all these people get caught up in all this crap thinking that they're part of some mystical spiritual experience, and they're being manipulated by big money powers and foundations. Now, I don't believe that Christian theology and traditional Orthodox theology and the Bible is another part of the dialectic, precisely because the Christian philosophy of the human person is the historical instance by which we get the notion of human personhood. And that's excuse me, that's from the doctrines laid down by the church fathers and the councils based on the Bible and Christology and personhood. And if you want to learn more about that, listen to my lecture on logos and logoi, where I go into that into quite a bit of depth. And so you want to talk about liberty, you want to talk about the philosophy of liberty. Well, I've got news for you. There's no such thing as liberty without personhood. So you're talking about liberty. It makes absolutely no sense without a worldview within which persons are the active agents who operate with volition and liberty. And personhood only exists within a worldview in which there's a personal God, and you're made in the image of that God. See? So Far Eastern worldviews, Far Eastern religions do not believe in personal deities. Ultimately, they might have like lesser deities, avatars or something like this. Hindus might have gods, but the highest level of reality, absolute reality, is not personal, and that is across the board. I think maybe Zen Buddhism kind of thinks that God might be a real existence, but then it also, cancels itself out and talks about impersonal reality as well, being absolute. So that's confusing and nonsensical, and we're not going to waste a whole lot of time on Japanese Zen Buddhism, but Father Rose does cover it, interestingly, and that will touch on other books that he did, like or that Hiram Monk Damascene did about Christ, the eternal Tao. So we'll get to that eventually. But we are looking, as I said, to Orthodoxy and the religion of the future, and I've mentioned many times the doctrines of absolute divine simplicity, and how this is not the Orthodox worldview, because we believe when God said, "I am that I am," it's a personal covenantal God, and that's what distinguishes biblical theology from most of the other worldviews out there. Even if you believed in, say, some form of paganism, and you say, oh, well, Odin is personal, right? We believe in a personal God, Odin. But you don't, because ultimately the highest level of reality in the pagan worldview is fate, and it's impersonal, or some form of chaos, perhaps, right? Ultimately chaos or fate, or this another dialectic within paganism or something like that. That's the ultimate reality for you is still impersonal. Right? The gods are still in some way connected to fate or subject to fate. I mean, Plato talks about this at the end of the Republic with that weird mystical dream of the cosmos and the clocks and the gods and all this kind of stuff. It's very, very bizarre. But Rose, I almost said Quigley. I'm so locked into all the hours that we did talking about Carol Quigley. Father Rose, the preface here written by, I don't know, Hiram Monk Damascene or somebody, is excellent because it talks about the setting for this book and the Russian Orthodox Church, and how this book was very popular in Russia as a result of the Soviet period and all that. But it begins saying that the ecumenical movement is a heresy, and it is. The ecumenical heresy is apostasy, because it is, simply put, it's just a rejection of the Ten Commandments, right? You shall have no other gods. There's only one God. Ecumenism is based on the rejection of there being one true God. It's that simple. And the ecumenist movement is, as we said, a long time corollary of the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Council of Churches and the Green Movement and all that gobbledygook. And it goes back to revolutionary thought. I thought this was very enlightening, that the beginning of modern Illuminism, revolutionary thought, whatever, is, in the West at least, traced back to the character Joachim of Fior. I've written on this before. I've done articles talking about Joachim and his three ages of the age of the Father, the age of the Son, the age of the Spirit. That's not Orthodox theology. We don't teach that. The Bible doesn't teach that. Church fathers don't teach that. This was the idea cooked up by this weird monk, this weird Franciscan character, who believed that having any possessions was evil. Very bizarre. Christianity did not teach this. But you get these people who go to the book of Acts, right, when they were living in a kind of quasi-monastic existence, and then they try to force this on everybody, right? Communism. Look, the apostles are sharing their goods in the book of Acts, therefore communism. No. Okay, we've got millennia of Christianity that has parceled out that there are different ways of living for different people. Right, not everybody is fit for monastic life. Not everybody is fit for secular life, quote unquote. Not everybody's fit to be a ruler. Not everybody's fit to be a philosopher. All these different people have different callings, and they're different. Not everybody's meant to be married. Some people are meant to be single. That's okay. But what happens is, a lot of times you get these sort of fanatic characters who depart from the traditions of the church. They depart from the Bible, and they get these fiery ideas of how they're going to create some utopian perfect community or movement or something like this. And generally speaking, they believe that they're inspired by the Spirit or enthusiasm, as Kant talked about. Locke. The enthusiast movements. And in Orthodoxy and Russian philosophy, you have this character of Nikolai Berdyaev. And Berdyaev promoted this ecumenist and charismatic, quote-unquote, type stuff in the Eurasian realm. And it's just simply not true. right? There's no new revelation that the Spirit is going to lead some giant UN body or the World Council of Churches or some weirdo sect out in the middle of nowhere to replace what's already been laid down. And it's just that simple. And anybody who's read the Bible and been to the liturgy for a period of time and has read the Church Fathers in any stretch, or read the Acts of the 7 Ecumenical Councils, for example, there's no way you would ever fall for any of this stuff, right? Because it's just ludicrous. Now, unfortunately, we have in the West mass ignorance, and people don't know any of this stuff. Totally unexposed to tradition, totally unexposed when it comes to the teachings of the 7 Ecumenical Councils and their canons. And this applies even, unfortunately, to the Orthodox world, so-called, in the West at least. I don't know what Orthodoxy is like in Russia. I've never been there. I can't speak for that. There's internet articles, but, I take internet articles about what's happening in other countries with a grain of salt. And because there's so much psyops and gobbledygook nonsense. So, in Rome, we had a long period where in the Roman Catholic Church in the West, the 20th century, where they tended early on to reject ecumenism and syncretism and charismaticism. And those things all go together. And that's not accidental. Because they're all part of the same heresy. And so this idea that we can have this generic monotheism based on generic ideas, right? And we can, the Jew and the Hindu, I guess you could throw the Hindu in there because some of them are monotheists. If you believe that the all or the absolute is everything, I guess then everything's God, then there's only one God, right? But ultimately that's just gobbledygook, because then if everything is God, then nothing's God. So the idea that Judaism and Christianity and Islam are all united in the idea of the same God is just simply not true, because of the Orthodox teaching that the Logos is who created the world. So the Jewish theology and Islamic theology do not teach that. They do not teach an ex nihilo creation by the Son of God. So you're talking about a different God. Now, why did they come to that conclusion? Well, I can tell you that when you read the horrible apologetic work known as the Summa Contra Gentiles of Thomas Aquinas, the entire first volume of that Summa is dedicated to doing apologetics on the basis of the idea of generic theism. But you see, there's no such thing as generic theism. There's no generic idea of God, quote unquote, that everyone shares that is a starting point for philosophy or for theology. The only God that exists is the God of the Bible. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who's a personal God. And that personal God is the God who promised a Messiah who would be his own son. The triune God, you see. And that's why Orthodox theology and tradition has the, quote, Old Testament saints as icons, right? I bought an icon of Daniel because I love the book of Daniel when I was at the shrine of St. Photius in Florida, because I know that Orthodox theology doesn't teach that there is a Masonic generic theism known as little g God that all the religions share. That's just simply not true. Now, yeah, there are some fuzzy aspects of things because, in a sense, like say when an Islamic person, for example, speaks of Allah. Now, if you go to the Orthodox liturgy in Arabic, it also uses Allah. But that does not mean that the Orthodox person and the Muslim are both worshiping the same deity, because they have radically different views of what that deity is and who he does, what he does. The Orthodox view is that God is distinct from his operations, essence, energy distinction, and that he's personal, and that you can know him principally through the Logos, the Son of God. Islamic theology teaches that you don't have a personal relationship with God based on love and theosis. You have a master-slave relationship to God. And you just simply obey because you're supposed to. And you don't literally commune with that deity. You don't participate in his deifying life, light, and energies. Because it's not really ultimately possible to talk about that God as, quote, personal. Because that would be a kind of idolatry. So, like Judaism, Islam believes in absolute divine simplicity, which makes God ultimately unknowable, untouchable, and unreachable, and ultimately leads to atheism. And so, Islam, as St. John of Damascus says, is a heresy. And it might more properly be called a heresy, precisely because it does try to have some view of Christ, which is kind of Nestorian, basically. So Islam is a kind of Nestorian mix with Christianity and Judaism. It's like Nestorian so-called Christianity mixed with Judaism. And for Orthodox theology, those are heresies. So there's no generic deity any more than Orthodox Christians are united with Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, give me a break. Any more than Orthodoxy is united with Mormonism or Scientology, okay? So all errors on God hinge, we believe, on those basic points that I mentioned. Number one, absolute reality is personal. God's personal. Man's made in his image as the image of a personal God. And the God that we're speaking of here is never ever revealed as generic godness, generic theism. None of that Thomistic gobbledygook, get it out of here. Only revealed as the personal, I am, covenantal God from the nation of Israel. That's the only true God, who is now taught in the nation of Israel that is spread throughout the world, called the Orthodox Church. That is the true vine. If you read Romans 11, that's what St. Paul teaches. There's no other traditions or sources by which you get access to this vine. Now, there might be aspects of this tradition elsewhere out there, but by the way, the Quran proponents, every Muslim that I've had debates with, and I just had a few fierce ones in the last few weeks, they don't know anything about the Bible. They're completely ignorant about the Bible, and you're talking to a brick wall when you're trying to speak of, like if you try to explain the book of Hebrews or something like that to somebody who's Islamic in their beliefs, they have no idea what you're talking about. You're wasting your time. You're not going to get anywhere. They don't know what the temple was about. They don't know what's in Genesis. They don't know what symbology and typology is. They don't understand Christ as the new high priest. They don't know any of that. So you got to start kind of more fundamental and try to say, well, what's your philosophy of God? But then most of those people, they don't care about philosophy. They don't know anything about it. You're, again, talking to a brick wall. So it's very difficult. It's almost like a cult. Like the experience that I've had is very similar to cults, where it's like you can't look. If I say, hey, let's look at these prophecies in Daniel and how later Jesus comes and fulfills them. Look at the promises of the covenant, right, all the successive covenants in the Old Testament and how they're fulfilled in the prophet, priest, king, great high priest character of Jesus. Like, they don't know what you're talking about. So, I don't know. It's very difficult. I have to figure out how to actually have dialogue and conversation with Islamic persons. And when I say dialogue and conversation, I'm talking about apologetics. I'm not talking about UN, ecumenist, relativism, syncretism, gobbledygook, apostasy. Now, one of the ways that and by the way, to show that's all true, there's a great point made that you can't just talk about the Abrahamic covenant as if, we'll talk to the Jewish person and we'll talk to the Islamic person because of the Abrahamic covenant, because of monotheism. When Paul says in Galatians the only access to the Abrahamic covenant is in Christ, right? This is Galatians 3. So no pagan gods, right? So this is all just based on stupid linguistics anyway, that as if just saying the word God, that everyone means the same thing. No, they don't. I mean, I might say, oh, there's one God and he's Satan. There's one God, but it's Lucifer. But we're not going to do ecumenical dialogue based on the fact that we both believe in one God. It's just retarded. But a lot of this is built on false spiritual experiences, and that's the first approach that we have to some of these ecumenical and religion of the future questions, right? And if we think back to Brave New World, which is interesting because Huxley does come up in this book, by the way, which is good. It's great. We think back to Brave New World, Huxley says you're going to get a civic created religion that's kind of like Masonry mixed with Anglicanism or something like that, that'll have charismatic worship services and like sex dance parties. I'm not joking. All right, so Huxley's talking about charismatic stuff. Now, if you go back and you watch Huxley's Berkeley lecture, where he brags about all this stuff, and admits, by the way, that he's part of the conspiracy. He's not a liberal humanitarian. There's a great point in that lecture where Huxley talks about revivalist preachers. I'm not joking. He talks about John Wesley and revivalism. Now, why on earth would Aldous Huxley be interested in revivalism, charismaticism, and John Wesley, or Jonathan Edwards, or any of the hellfire brimstone Americanist phony balonies? Well, because of the power of preaching the spoken word and false spiritual experiences. And that's why, for example, the CIA and the Pentagon were interested in Billy Graham crusades. And you can find this detailed in Ingdahl's book, Lost Hegemon. But I went and dug this up too. It's all true. All right, so you can dig all this up. Just Google Pentagon connections, CIA connections to evangelicalism, revivalism. There's a great article that I just came across by... I'm not advocating this website, by the way. I don't know anything about it, but I just read this article. It was good. Barbara Aho? I don't know. But she wrote a good piece talking about the Jesus movement, the charismatic movement, and their connection to the CIA. Yes, exactly. Because the Jesus movement was also connected to Laurel Canyon and that kind of stuff. So we're finding a lot of our suspicions that we've talked about for a long time actually are being borne out by independent researchers and people putting together these kinds of essays. And this essay is called Antipas CIA Connections. Antipas CIA Connections. So I don't know anything about Barbara Aho. I'm not advocating her work or anything beyond this article. Yes, and that ties in perfectly with what we're talking about here, because we did a boiler room that was really good on CIA usage of cults. So if you haven't listened to that, go check that out, because we talk about Laurel Canyon and we talk about Jim Jones and all that. You can also find in the archives my interviews with James Kelly on cults, Jim Jones, Nation of Islam, all that stuff. Good refresher type stuff. But as we were saying, the false spiritual experiences in the Hindu logos. What? Yes. Hindus will talk about a logos. They'll talk about a trinity. They'll use a lot of these terms. Don't fall for it. And I've read Ananda Kumaraswamy and the perennialists and the traditionalists who try to talk about Hinduism as a good thing, and it's not. It's a very deceptive satanic religion, I believe, and they will use these terms just as kind of trickery, the same way that Mormons will use these terms and try to trick people into joining their Mormon cult because they talk about Jesus and getting saved and all this crap. What is the number one red flag for this stuff? Well, it's very, very obvious once you think about it, especially if you have any kind of sort of basic biblical knowledge, is that we would say that law from God is a good thing, and that liberty presupposes law, ultimately divine law. So you can't be a human person without some defining limits, and that's not a bad thing. Limits and boundaries are not a bad thing. Acts 17:26 says God made all the nations from one and set their determined times and boundaries. So limitations are a good thing in the biblical worldview. They're not bad. Ethnoi is a good thing, right? The Tower of Babel was dispersed by God because he saw that it was a good thing, right? To not have humans try to unite in under a world Babylonian government, because it would be oppressive and even worse. So that's why we have the Tower of Babel. But of course, mankind and the EU and their Babel logo and all this, and the UN thinks that they can erect an earthly kingdom without God, without Christ, without divine law. Now, this can't happen. It's always doomed to failure, and it's ultimately satanic, and that's why it turns into like the worst thing ever with 100 million skulls. Remember Dostoevsky's demons, right? We're going to have a world revolution for freedom. We're going to build a utopia. Oh, oops, sorry. It's going to take 100 million dead people to build our utopia. That's the result of man's law, autonomy. So we would say that divine law is a good thing, and it's health, it's medicine, it's freedom. This is Psalm 119, right, that goes into great depth speaking of God's law. And it's the Logos who gave all those laws, right? So get out of here, Orthodox Gnostics. We don't need you talking about how Jesus is the love God of the New Testament and Jehovah is the hate God of the Old Testament. And that is very popular in faux American Orthodoxy, but you are just a bunch of heretics. So get out of here. So Shiva, okay, Shiva shrines, and what is the point of all this? Self-worship. And this is the big key here. This is the great apologetic point, actually, is that Hinduism's sort of founding principle is that you are God. That's what all the cults are going to tell you too. Oh, or you're God, or you're going to be God. You're the real God. The real God is within you. Well, that's an obvious lie, because that's what Genesis 3 talks about, right? This is what the deceiver, what Satan says in Genesis when he goes against divine law. He says, no. Don't listen to divine stipulation and law. You are your own God. God doesn't want you deciding for yourself. Right here we have the libertarian anarcho Eden movement, Occupy Eden by Lucifer here. And so prelest is the basic Orthodox spiritual principle that we want to avoid when it comes to, quote, spirituality, and that is the sin of pride and being puffed up thinking that you got it all figured out, which saying that you're God is pretty much the most extreme form of that, right? Prelest in the extreme, that Hinduism whispering in your ear that you are God. Hinduism has a lot of black magic. It has a lot of gobbledygook and dangerous stuff, and ultimately ends up in monism. And this is what we said, that the idea that all reality is one reality, and that difference and distinction is all illusion, and the source of bad, the source of badness, the source of evil is in distinction. This is a common teaching of all the Eastern philosophies, and unfortunately Platonism and Aristotle, ultimately. Well, we don't believe that. We don't believe that there's something bad about being distinct. There's nothing bad about being unique. There's nothing bad about being about difference. God created an established difference. And we believe that in God there's no dialectical tension between the one and the many. Likewise, in the world, in man's experience, we need to not be trapped in dialectical tensions, right? Now, where we differ, now the Eastern philosophers Far East, they'll agree with that. They'll say, yes, you are right. We need to not be trapped in dialectics. You get it, my son. Jason, you get it. But their answer is nonsense. You see, they have the bad. They're a little bit right there with they're wanting to get rid of the dialectics. Problem is that they offer the solution that is self-negation, self-destruction, self-annihilation. Right? So get rid of the self, dissolve into thusness, dissolve into the absolute. You got to cease to exist. So ultimately, no, this is stupid. This is obviously diabolical. And this is also why in Far Eastern states in history, you have the most extreme forms of statism, right? Like you can't use you speak of we, right? You don't even look at the emperor, all this gobbledygook, the Chinese emperor, because you are nothing. You are a drop of water in the giant vast ocean that is embodied in the emperor and the collective. Well, no, we don't believe that. And we don't believe that because we don't believe in the philosophy that says that distinctions are evil, right? So in our day, it's very popular with the UN or the Huxley model. If you read Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, this is what he says. He's talking about the new religion there, the new world religion. And he says, we'll have these little tidbits, breakfast buffet aspect of different religions. We'll even talk about grace, right? We'll talk about grace. But ultimately, the God that we're worshiping here is the impersonal absolute. That's what Aldous Huxley says in the Perennial Philosophy. So, no, we don't want any of that. We believe that's satanic. That's diabolical because it means that there's no such thing as personhood, right? And this is the great error of our day, is the rejection of personhood, and you only get personhood with a personal God. So out with the monism, out with the self-worship. And why do I say all that? And what was I saying about law being good? Because the law says avoid idolatry. Okay? So idolatry is what gives birth to all this stuff. Idolatry is saying, I'm God. Saying I'm God, well, number one, it's not true. It's also the height of pride and prelest. And it's self-destructive. That's the point here, is that, you see, law is given for health, for your good. What did Jesus say about the Sabbath? The Sabbath was given for man, not man. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right, to the Pharisees. Because they tried to turn the law around into being this self-destructive thing where, you can't even be healed because it's the Sabbath. Well, that's ridiculous. Right? And that's a form of idolatry. In the same way, Hinduism is an idolatrous religion, not just because you've got all these little idols everywhere, right? Idolatry is first and foremost a sin of the heart, then it gives expression in bodily postures or whatever. But it begins in the heart by saying or attributing deity or godhood to a thing that is not God. And to therefore then subject oneself to creation as a subject or slave, when God made man in his image to be the master of creation. So the Harvard East Coast elites, interestingly, and illuminists such as Huxley, William Somerset Maugham, Teilhard de Chardin, and Thomas Merton are all critiqued very well in this chapter on Hinduism. She correctly points out that when they are chanting to Kali and invoking evil, that they're worshiping devils, which is what the Bible says. Yes, absolutely. And when people, quite often, they'll do this. They'll take hallucinogens and they'll invoke evil, and an evil force will overtake them and they'll go mad. That's because evil is real. You're trying to tap into these forces with spiritual pride, thinking that you can control them, and they end up controlling you, and you go crazy. I mean, look at the life of Aleister Crowley. Come on. Now, the Eastern Coast Harvard elites are behind this ecumenical destruction of America and the UN and all that gobbledygook. That's all explained. The Parliament of Religions is, as I said, this 1893 movement started by a, quote, unknown Hindu monk, yeah, right, who just showed up in Chicago. Swami Vivekananda. I'm Swami Vivekananda. You must worship all gods. All gods are true. They took the stones from here. That's from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, by the way. Yeah, actually, you would get more of a picture of what's really going on here if you go watch Temple of Doom. Okay, so Temple of Doom is much more the thuggy cult, right? That's the real story here. Human sacrifice, cannibalism. That really goes on. Okay, and that's what these religions in their secret esoteric teachings actually say. Again, just like Mormonism or Scientology, there's kind of the exoteric dogma, and then there's the esoteric dogma. And if you, these goofballs have been messaging me on Twitter and saying, oh, that's what Christianity teaches too. No, actually it doesn't. Read Irenaeus Against the Heresies. If you read that, you'll find out that Irenaeus says that what distinguishes Christianity from the Gnostic religions is that we don't have an exoteric-esoteric divide. Now, that does not mean that there aren't mysteries and deep things of the Spirit and of Scripture that a lot of people don't understand. Jesus says that. Jesus says, I speak in parables, and most of you don't understand it. And they don't. That's true. Because one can only understand those things through the giving of the Holy Spirit. However, as Moses said, would that all God's people received the Spirit and prophesied, and that's what we believe the church is, right? So the establishment of the church, Pentecost, and then it's spreading into the nations, and that's the preaching of the word and the giving of the Spirit through those means, has poured the Spirit out on all. That's the meaning of Pentecost and the outpouring upon all people, right? That Joel talks about, the prophet Joel. Fulfilled at Pentecost, not in some goofy end times thing or at John Hagee's church. So it's good to see that that's all pointed out here. And we get into Thomas Merton and how he convinced all the Roman Catholic monks to get into Zen. And then he, fortuitously gets electrocuted backing into a fan before going to a giant ecumenical meeting. You can judge that however you will. And I like, too, that we have in this chapter the connection to Hinduism. And how many times have I pointed out that evolution is just Hindu doctrine? And Huxley's promoted it as the prophet of our age. And why? Well, Huxley was just basically tripped out. And I mean, when Huxley writes like Eyeless in Gaza and talks about demons and stuff like that, he's not just writing literature, or when he talks about communing with forces of nature and all, whatever esoteric gobbledygook, he's talking about like demonic stuff. He's a Luciferian. So, I mean, I've had bad trips. I know what happens. I know what Huxley's talking about. Okay, my doors of perception have been opened, and it's all real. And that's what MK Ultra is about. Ultimately, it is a kind of. There was a great point Dugan made about like the prophets of Lucifer and Satanism. Like it's almost like Satan's kingdom has its holy fools and its holy prophets, like in the reverse though. Okay. And Huxley is kind of that, he is that kind of a character. Like he's more satanic than LaVey. Way more evil. Because LaVey's a carnival man, right? He's a performer. Literally was in the circus. Aldous Huxley is the appearance of liberal, the appearance of erudite, the appearance of scholarly, literary, all this kind of stuff. And I think that Huxley literally embodies the most satanic form of the West. Him and Bertrand Russell, I guess. But Bertrand Russell, you could maybe even argue, I've always said Russell's the most evil man, but actually you could argue probably Huxley was more evil than Russell, because Huxley figured out how to destroy religion in the West. And Bertrand Russell wasn't very good at that because he was just so crass and bald-faced, bare-faced, pale atheist, right, as Nietzsche says. So I don't know that Russell really had that much effect on destroying Christianity. He was just kind of this calculating technocrat. Whereas Huxley is over here like devising, giant ecumenical projects to completely destroy Christianity. So I'm going to have to say, I guess, yeah, Huxley's more evil than Bertrand Russell. So Teilhard de Chardin, who I've mentioned many times, gets his evolutionary theory straight out of the Vedas, totally rips it off. A pseudo-intellectual, phony, total fraud, total scam artist. And evolution is at the heart of this new philosophy. This is why I harp on evolution. And I get made fun. I don't care, by the way, when people make fun of me. It doesn't bother me. Because I don't adopt evolutionary theory. But I'm telling you, it's dumb. Okay, I'm a philosophy major. I know philosophy. Nobody denies that I'm good at philosophy. Unless they're just using ad hominems. Even the people that can't stand what I do admit that I know what I'm talking about. I'm a smart, clever dude. And I'm telling you, when you look at evolution as a philosophy, that's how you understand its nonsense. Okay, and people don't do this because they think it's, quote, science. And they have this mistaken assumption that there's this worldview, an approach to life called science, and that it operates in a neutral, objective fashion without presuppositions, and it operates outside of like the parameters of religion or biology or engineering, and it doesn't. There's no such thing as this other approach that's called science that's like some kind of magical window into truth. No, all worldviews are governed by our presuppositions, and so the way to dismantle and knock apart these false philosophies like Darwinism is through philosophical critique. But it takes being grounded in good philosophy to do that. And that's what we're trying to do here at Jay's Analysis, is help people be grounded in good philosophy and how to do presuppositional critique, how to do objective metaphysical analysis, how to do analytical logical analysis, point out the fallacies, and not just point out fallacies like these independent media goofballs are out here trying to do, without any like replacement philosophy. Okay, there's no such thing as just rational trivium. You need the theology that gave the pedagogy of the classical world. And that theology is the theology of Eastern Orthodox theology. So LSD, parapsychology, all part of MKUltra, and this was studied together with youth culture, and it all ties into Crowley's Eastern wisdom, quote unquote. Page 53, the new religious consciousness and the spread of Eastern cults into the 70s. And then we get the Hare Krishna movement, which ultimately kind of failed. I was reading some good articles this last week on Hare Krishna, and it same ideas all the time. It's always connected to bigger players and the export. Again, when the Rockefeller Foundation and these globalist entities were behind this world parliament of religions and the ecumenical movement, which sprung from Hinduism, when they promoted this in the West, it was not because they give two shits about theology other than to destroy it. Okay, so that's their motivation. So when they promote the missionaries of Hinduism coming into the West, which, by the way, I thought that's not very liberal to try to destroy people's tradition and heritage through missionary work. I thought that was evil. No, it's only evil when you're destroying false philosophies, but when you're importing pagan and demonic philosophies, it's good. And you look at what the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all these foundations have funded. They do not fund this kind of stuff. Okay, I mean, they're not funding Orthodoxy and the religion of the future. I can guarantee you that. And so we have good critiques here of the Sikhs, them being used, of cults. Yes, absolutely. As we've said many times, we've done many podcasts and talks on cults, how they're used by intelligence agencies and foundations. Promotion of esoteric thought through science fiction. Glad to see Father Rose talking about H.G. Wells and evolution. Yes, you see, I am not the only person to talk about these things. I did not know, by the way, that Father Rose talks about H.G. Wells and science fiction, so I didn't steal that from him. I'm doing this podcast to promote his book. Okay, so I'm not ripping things off. The promotion of exotheology, transhumanism, and aliens, all pointed out by Father Rose. Science fiction is esoteric propaganda. Amen. Absolutely. It promotes transhumanism, becoming more than human, beyond human, more human than a human. Yes. And he even talks about Soviet science fiction, which always blended science and magic under the guise of materialism. Well, materialism is a magical worldview where matter suddenly sprouts things like consciousness and stuff like that. It was just gobbledygook mythology under the guise of, quote, science. And Soviet science fiction always promoted the idea that the higher stage of humanism is occultism, interestingly. Meanwhile, of course, they're all saying materialism. But again, materialism is a nonsensical ruse to dupe people. Promotion of the ideas like the Force in Star Wars. Yeah, well, you could argue Star Wars has had more impact on Western pop culture, and I guess now global pop culture, than maybe anything else in the last century, pop culture-wise. Is Star Wars at the top? Probably. I can't think of any other pop culture thing that would top it. Certainly not James Bond. So, hello, what have we here? Lando Calrissian wants you to believe in the Force. Yes, the Force, the impersonal God that's both good and evil, that can be controlled through meditation techniques that only Yoda can show you. You gotta have a Yoda strapped to your back, and then you might be able to levitate the X-Wing out of the swamp goo. But, you know, if you think about it, speaking of swamp goo, like, the Star Wars worldview is just as scientific and sensible as the Darwinian worldview of the swamp goo. Lightning bolts from Zeus hitting the swamp goo, creating life, creating beings. That's literally, that's in Greek mythology, by the way. Right? Humans are the creation of the accidental creation of lightning bolts hitting dirt and producing clay. And that's literally what Darwinism says. Exotheology, the idea of Jesus being a space brother, a space being. This is discussed in the chapter on Signs from Heaven. This is a really good chapter. Transhumanism ties into aliens. Yes, how long have we been saying that aliens, and the mythology of aliens, is a guide to transhumanism? And in fact, we are a prep for transhumanism. We will be doing a show, Jay Wiedner and I, on the Alien series in our TV show. And that was my analysis. What's it about? Well, it's about bioengineering, the xenomorphs, bioweapons, and aliens are ultimately just these sort of transhumanist things in that storyline, I'm saying. So it's neat to see an Orthodox theologian here backing up everything I've been saying. So, Arthur C. Clarke, yes, also in the circles of Crowley. The overlords are evolutionarily advanced. Yeah, right. The overmind, yeah. Same old story. Day the Earth stood still, the aliens come and tell us, if you don't form a global government, we're going to have to wipe you all off the planet. Just total nonsense. Total Pentagon psyop. Total bullshit created by the Pentagon. Esoteric sci-fi, as we said, yes. Science fiction as propaganda. in Efremov's and other science fiction, communism becomes the cosmic force that begins to acquire non-materialistic qualities. The advanced beings of the outer space, exotheology, are often endowed with savior-like qualities. Well, of course. The loss of Christian values and Christian theology in the West has thus become the vacuum allows for the vehicle, the dissemination of non-Christian philosophy of life through science fiction. Absolutely. That's a big part of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols, which is my book, which you can get at my website, signed copies. Please don't get them on Amazon. Get them directly from me under the tab Purchase Signed Copies of Esoteric Hollywood. Now, there's some good overview history of the UFO, Foo Fighter, flying object phenomenon around page 79, 80, 81, and on. But one of the problems I have with Father Rose's book, as I said at the beginning, was that he's not skeptical of these characters, and we can forgive him because, he's a monk, he's a theologian. He's not sitting around studying the machinations of the evil deep state, right? So he's not expecting all these deep state characters who come out talking about aliens to necessarily be totally lying and erecting a giant alien scam. But he is correct that it is all a giant UFO alien scam, as I've said many times. And so we agree with his thesis overall. I just wish that, when he's talking about Kenneth Arnold and these different characters who are the supposed origins of UFOs and Close Encounters, I wish he'd been a little more critical of those characters. Like Project Blue Book, I think that's a total psyop. So I would have liked it if he had critiqued it also from the vantage point of just these people are liars. And you can't believe what these generals and military intelligence people tell you. They're the first, that's like the first red flag to make them suspect, is if there's some general or psyops official or some crap like that. So he talks about the UFO alien hoax on page 81, which is good because it's like the Darwin hoax, and he's using the hoax here in the sense of being a vehicle for the promotion of the New Age religion. And so in that regard, yes, we agree. It is a vehicle for the promotion of a New Age religion. And, we can have the side debate on how much of it's real. Is an aspect of this demonic? I still hold out that as a possibility. But I think a lot of this is the deep state testing stuff, right? And actually trying to foster a new religion. And that's actually what we're going to see admitted actually in a couple places in this book. Think of the Fourth Kind, right, with Mila Jovovich. Not the greatest movie, but actually kind of revealing because it presents the aliens as demons. They're the gods of Mesopotamia in that movie. And any movie where you get to look at Mila Jovovich is tolerable, right? So in the Space Boy, what's a common theme here? He's talking about J. Allen Hynek, the UFO experience. Well, one of the common themes is that evolution is always taught, and the aliens are always coming to bring peace. Exactly. Yeah, the alien agenda always matches up with the globalist agenda. Isn't that what a coincidence? The Rockefeller Foundation message just happens to always be what the aliens. I mean, if they're really aliens coming and visiting, why don't they have like the Donald Trump agenda, right? Like, why don't they have I don't know, what else is there? They don't ever teach like the Orthodox theological agenda, right? The aliens have talked to me. Okay, Donald Trump, I think you're gonna be very, very happy. I've talked to the aliens, and we're gonna work together. A lot of alien jobs are gonna be coming back to America. I think that you're going to be very pleased. The Space Brothers are very nice people, very, very, very wonderful. Actually, they're gonna be working with us, and we have the same goals. All right. Make America alien again. That was just some goofy improv that hit me out of nowhere, I guess. The aliens inspired me to do that. Right, but I'm just making the point that the aliens don't ever say something like that. Like, they're not... The aliens are never here to bring jobs back to America. The aliens are never here to dismantle globalism. Right? So, I know I shouldn't be laughing at my own jokes here, but so, oh man, interesting quote for you, Ameridox. That is the American Orthodox people who don't really follow or believe Orthodox theology. Where Seraphim Rose talks about the legitimate state authority being the Orthodox emperor. Page 108, 109. Oops. Uh-oh. Don't ever use that quote. That's not very good with our libertarian orthodoxy, our Democratic Party orthodoxy. Right? You're never going to hear that in the Greek Orthodox diocese. So, charismaticism and ecumenism. We're going to get into some of this, how that's tied together. The history of the Pentecostal cults. Yes, Pentecostal cults. And Project Bluebeam. And celestial intelligences. And I think, though, to wrap up this first hour, or hour and 15 minutes, there's a great Jacques Vallée quote that really sums it up, lays it all out, and I'm glad that Father Rose included this in the book. And here's the key. It's all laid out here on page 100. It is possible to take large sections of any population and make them believe in the existence of supernatural races, in the possibility of flying machines, and in the plurality of inhabited worlds, by exposing them to a few carefully engineered scenes, the details of which are adapted to the culture and superstitions of a particular time and place. Boom. Yes. It is an alien CIA psyop. And that is exactly the same methodology that we see in the creation of vampires in the Philippines in Victor Marchetti's book with John Marks, CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, which I included in my book. And that's exactly what Jacques Vallée admits the CIA and the deep state do with the alien gobbledygook. Thank you. Vindicated. Get out of here. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the first free half of a full discussion, which is available to subscribers to my website, jaysanalysis.com. You can subscribe for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. And you'll get the full talks, archives, and lectures, Tragedy and Hope, Plato, a million other things. You can also purchase signed copies of my book, Esoteric Hollywood Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, only at jaysanalysis.com. Thank you for listening.